Okay, so here we go. We're doing despite the fact that. Pretty important phrase. I think it will. It helps improve quality of writing. As we be going over a lot of these phrases and words that are sort of transitory words that show transition or show nuance, and I think that raises the level of the quality of writing multiple notches. And this is one of those phrases. So let's learn about it. Despite the fact that it normally rains a lot in February in the Pacific Northwest, it hasn't rained much this month here in Seattle. Okay, so despite the fact that it normally rains a lot in February in the Pacific Northwest, it hasn't rained much this month here in Seattle. So let's say you said, let's just test out some of these sentences. So let's say you said, in, Seattle, Washington, USA, it hasn't rained much here in Seattle this month. It looks awkward, right? It's just a little bit much, right? Seattle, comma, Washington, comma, USA. As a writer, whenever you're writing anything, whether it's for an assignment or for an exercise, or you're writing an article, or you're writing a book, any kind of writing or an email, you want to sort of keep in mind the venue. And one of the venues, quote unquote, one of the important characteristics of the sort of homework venue, or even just the regular writing venue, is that you don't want to have too much punctuation, especially when you've got all these commas. Especially when you could display a sentence that has a much simpler punctuation and gets the point across better and clearer. So let's highlight this. Despite the fact that it normally rains a lot in February in the Pacific Northwest, so we're talking about the general Pacific Northwest, meaning that most readers, are going to know what that is, and it also depends on the venue, right? But most readers, so you want to, be as clear as possible. This is kind of the thesis of a lot of these videos: is be as clear as possible, but make the reader work a little, right? So don't always spell out the obvious, the super obvious. So right here, the Pacific Northwest, you don't have to explain what that is. I guess if you wanted to, you could here, Oregon, Washington, Idaho. But it's generally pretty clear. People know what it is. And also, if later on in the sentence there are context clues, let the context clues work for you, for your writing. Right? So there's a context clue. So Seattle, how many Seattles are there in the world? Like The Simpsons is Springfield. There are lots of Springfields around the country. But in Seattle, there aren't that many Seattles that people know of readily. So I think that when it says, oh, Seattle, that's in Washington, that's in the U.S., that means that the Pacific Northwest is a region of probably of the country, the United States, that Seattle belongs in. So even if someone didn't know where the Pacific Northwest was, these context clues make it very helpful. So this is a little much. Writing all this stuff here is just a little bit much. So we're going to erase this. And despite the fact that, despite the fact that It normally rains a lot in February in the Pacific Northwest. It hasn't rained much this month. It hasn't rained much this month here in Seattle. A bit of a tongue twister with the word much and month. But if you say it hasn't rained this month much here in Seattle, that looks very bad. Or if you say this month here in Seattle much, hasn't rained this month here in Seattle much, it doesn't sound as good. And I think, the big key is reading a lot. Because it definitely can help you in terms of hearing the clarity of how the sentence sounds and how good it sounds or how bad it sounds. So I think this construction is the best for this sentence. Also, you want this to be general, despite the fact that it normally rains a lot in February in the Pacific Northwest, which is more of a general area, a larger area, and then you're going tighter. It wouldn't make sense if you say, despite the fact that it normally rains a lot in February in Seattle, it hasn't rained much this month in the Pacific Northwest. So if I took this and replaced it with this, it doesn't make sense, right? Despite the fact that it normally rains a lot in February in Seattle, it hasn't rained much this month here in the Pacific Northwest. You could say here in the Pacific Northwest in general, but it's a little bit heavy. It gets a little bit onerous for the reader to comprehend. Now, obviously, we can break some of this stuff up in 2 or 3 sentences, but that's normally not ideal when you're talking about some of these words and phrases that show nuance and show contrast, comparison, that allow the reader to compare and contrast, or to see the writer comparing and contrasting, rather. So it's just a little bit much. I think most people would see that this would sense that this just makes a lot more sense, despite the fact that it normally rains a lot in February in the Pacific Northwest. Right, well, this is just like a general sort of a weather prediction, a weather analysis that most people would know about. Okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense. In February, in that area of the country, yeah, it's probably going to rain a lot. That makes sense, right? You start out wide and then you get tighter. But then it hasn't rained much this month here in Seattle, which makes sense because that's where the person is. So the person who's writing lives in a specific city, right? So it sort of fits. There's a logical flow. So make sure that your logical flow, make sure that there is logical flow. And we're talking about, in terms of time, in terms of space, in terms of, connections. There's got to be a logic, because then it makes it very, very clear. So right here, and now what is implied? So what is implied? Well, it is implied that what time period are we in right now when this sentence is completed? It's the end of February, or very close to it. All right, so this is a plus, that you're able to sort of include some of these implications in this sentence without explicitly stating them. So embedded in this sentence, it's not the greatest sentence in the world, but it's, there are some, what's great about using these phrases in for example, this phrase, is that you can pack in some of these implications. So it rains a lot in February. It hasn't rained much this month here in Seattle. So we're either at the end of February or very close to it, because you have many, many days that you're probably, able to make this analysis. The writer is able to make this analysis. At least it's probably at least the 15th or the 20th. At least it's getting towards the end and not like the 4th or the 6th. So that's kind of cool, just to keep that in mind, that you don't have to unnecessarily pack the sentence with too much information. And then what is explicit, as I stated earlier. So what is explicitly stated? We are in Seattle. or the writer rather. The writer is in Seattle. Right? So here in Seattle, the writer's in Seattle. This is really key. Be as clear as possible, but let the reader work a little. And I think we are doing that. We're not saying, it's the end of the month, it's the end of February today, and despite the fact that it normally rains a lot, so let's write that, right? So you could say, it's February 28th today, and despite the fact that it normally rains a lot in February in the Pacific Northwest, it hasn't rained this much this month here in Seattle. It's a little much, right? That's a little bit much. I mean, and then this, you're thinking like, oh, is this a run-on? Well, if it is indeed a run-on, you could say, then you have to start with and, for it to really flow, or you have to change it to also. Also, despite the fact that it rains, I mean, it's just gets a little unwieldy. So what you want to do is it's called addition by subtraction, right? You want to add, you want to subtract from the sentence and make the reader think a little bit. So we get the feeling, right? We explicitly know that the writer's in Seattle. We also know that it's probably towards the end of the month in February. This is fine. This is great. I think this is great. I think this is one of the best constructions of this type of sentence. You don't need to add all the other extra stuff to it. Let's write another one. Despite the fact that I have 3 years of technical education experience, I still make regular newbie mistakes in the web design field. Okay, so decent sentence, despite the fact that. So it's a contrast, right? Despite the fact that it's a contrast. It's like even though, right? Even though it normally rains a lot in February in the North Pacific Northwest, it hasn't rained much this month here in Seattle. So synonymous with even though. Even though I have 3 years of technical education experience, I still make regular newbie mistakes in the web design field. So let's try a few other sentences that are very similar. So let's do, so the reason why this is good, again, this is general, right? The years of technical education experience, very general, right, overall. But the big question is, what kind of technical education are you talking about? So let's say, and then you want to be specific here, right? So then let's say I said this field. Confusing. It has now become a confusing sentence. Because the first thing you want to do is you want to think, what is the obvious question that the reader is going to ask, right? The obvious question. So what is the obvious question that the reader is going to ask, right? And answer it. So you can answer it in this sentence, or or the next sentence, the future sentences, but you definitely want to answer it. So, what is the first obvious question? So number one, what does technical education mean? Auto repairs, hardware, right? Ship repair, software, technical. What can be technical? IT, web design. It could be a whole bunch of stuff. Anything technical. It could be, could be robots. It could be like medical devices. I mean, it could be so much, right? So it's vague. It's vague. So because this is somewhat vague, we want to answer that question here. So this vague, a little bit vague. We answer that question like right here. So that's what improves this sentence here, is we're answering that question. Now let's say I said this. Now let's say I said regular zygote mistakes. Let's say that the word newbie is not a popular word in the web design field, even though it is. Let's say instead of the word newbie, the word zygote is used. Or let's say the word zygote is used in a small group in this web design field. That, well, the word zygote, yeah, I mean, a lot of people would know what it means. Something that's young, like a tadpole. Something that's someone that's brand new. But the word zygote is a little bit challenging. It's less obvious to your layperson reader that might not be in that field. And you always want to keep in mind the venue, right? What venue are you writing, this article in or this essay? So you could say zygote, but it could be confusing. So let's say you said zygote with a quotes. Well, the zygote with a quotes, you might describe this in the next sentence. For those laymen, this means this, or you could put in parenthesis, read, new person, in the field. But again, this is a lot of punctuation. Just a lot of punctuation. Even if you deleted this, it's, you could say, i.e. new person in the field. I mean, there's a lot you could do, but you generally don't want to go too bonkers on your punctuation. You want to be strategic. You want to vary. Let me write this out. You want to vary sentence structure and your punctuation. You want to be somewhat creative, right? You have all these parentheses and quotes and all that stuff. It gets really heavy. It gets really hard to read. So this is confusing. If you say the word zygote, like you and your friends, or you and a group uses the word zygote, you could put it in quotes, but it still doesn't answer that. It still doesn't answer the question. So you're probably going to have to write, i.e., new person in the field, etc. So what's ideal is making sure that the word that you choose, like newbie, because it has the word new in it, because the word newbie has the word new in it, and it is ubiquitous, means it's used everywhere in the software field. You don't need a parenthesis around it, nor do you need to describe it. Most readers will comprehend that newbie is probably a new person based on the context clues, especially the fact that new is in the word newbie, right? And the fact that you're talking about 3 years of technical education experience. I still make regular newbie mistakes. So those two pieces of evidence make it good enough and clear enough, that you can just leave the word newbie in there without having quotes, without explaining it, and the fact that the writer has over 3 years experience, but is still making mistakes. So these mistakes, it would be understood based on these pieces of evidence that their new person mistakes, because this this beautiful phrase um, makes the reader figure this out, right? Even though, right, despite the fact that even though I have 3 years of technical education experience, which is a lot of experience, right? It's a lot of education. I still make regular newbie mistakes in the web design field. This and then the fact that it's regular, it's like you're still making mistakes even though you have a lot of experience. So it's obvious that newbie, especially with the word new, is someone that is new or that is new to the industry. So this person still makes mistakes that someone new to the industry might be making. Hopefully this is clear. Um, and yeah, so despite the fact that my 2 sentences that I wanted to focus on today was, despite the fact that it normally rains a lot in February in the Pacific Northwest, it hasn't rained much this month here in Seattle. And despite the fact that I have 3 years of technical education experience, I still make regular newbie mistakes in the web design field. Hopefully, you see what despite the fact that means and how to use it in a sentence, but also you learned a little bit about how to improve the quality of your writing by making choices. And that's one thing that I think is very important to good writing, is making smart choices. And keep reading, keep writing. Thank you very much.